You say that nothing is wrong, the house is calm, the work is steady, the day passes without incident, by all measures life is fine, and yet you feel a subtle weight, a quiet tension, a restlessness that cannot be named. This is the paradox of suffering when nothing is wrong. It is not born from events, circumstances, or external threats. It is born from the mind itself, from the habits it has developed, from the way it interprets reality. Suffering does not require a problem. It does not wait for misfortune to arrive. It arises when the mind resists what is, when it insists on judging, controlling, or reacting to the neutral flow of existence. The mind, when untrained, is never still. In silence, it becomes loud. It scores memory for regrets, spins imagined catastrophes about the future, and paints ordinary moments with unnecessary significance. It invents struggle where there is none, because struggle has become familiar, even comforting. We mistake this inner turbulence for reality, believing that the presence of thought and tension defines life itself. A quiet day, a safe home, an uneventful hour. They are neutral by nature, yet the mind interprets them as incomplete, unworthy, or meaningless. We suffer because we are attached to our thoughts. Every passing worry, fear, or judgment is treated as urgent, as if it requires immediate action. Every fleeting emotion is seized, magnified, and woven into the story of who we are. The chains that bind us are invisible, made not of circumstance but of attention and identification. We do not notice them because we have learned to believe that thought equals truth, that reaction equals reality. Even when nothing is wrong, the mind clings, resists, and projects. Our identity is bound to struggle. From youth, we are taught that endurance, effort, and hardship define value. We grow accustomed to measuring ourselves through obstacles overcome and challenges faced. When life is easy, the mind feels lost. Calmness is unfamiliar, peace feels uncomfortable, contentment appears hollow. Restlessness arises not from the world, but from the habit of linking selfhood with tension. We seek difficulty even where there is none, because struggle has become the proof of existence. Peace is unsettling to the undisciplined mind. Stillness exposes the patterns of thought and emotion we have ignored, suppressed, or denied. Silence becomes a mirror, reflecting worry, desire, and fear that we had never confronted directly. In this reflection, the mind interprets itself as incomplete, threatened, or inadequate. It is uncomfortable precisely because it is unfamiliar, because the mind is not trained to observe without interference, to witness without judgment, to be present without reaction. True freedom lies not in controlling the world, nor in bending circumstances to our desire. It begins with observation, watching thought without being consumed by it, witnessing emotion without being carried away, seeing life as it is without labeling it as right or wrong. Observation creates a pause, a space between stimulus and response, a space in which suffering loses its grip. In that space, the mind begins to understand that peace does not need to be earned, contentment does not need justification, and life, in its quiet unfolding, is complete even when nothing seems wrong. You suffer not because the world is lacking, not because something is broken, not because life has failed you. You suffer because the mind has not been trained to rest, because thought has been mistaken for reality, because struggle has been mistaken for identity, and because silence has been mistaken for emptiness. The chains are real, yet invisible, forged by attachment, habit, and expectation. They are strengthened by distraction, fear, and unexamined patterns. The path to liberation begins with awareness, to notice without interference, to observe without judgment, to witness without attachment, to allow life to be as it is, without demanding that it conform to narrative, desire, or control. When this awareness deepens, suffering begins to dissolve, not because life changes, but because the mind changes. The illusions that bind us, thought mistaken for truth, tension mistaken for meaning, struggle mistaken for identity, begin to fade. In the presence of observation, nothing needs fixing, nothing needs proving, and nothing is missing. Suffering does not require a problem. It is a statement that seems paradoxical at first, because we have been conditioned to think of suffering as a direct response to hardship, misfortune, or conflict. We imagine that pain must have a cause outside of ourselves, that a misstep, a loss, or an obstacle is necessary to feel discomfort. Yet, when we look closely at our own experiences, we discover that the mind has an uncanny ability to create suffering even in the absence of any tangible difficulty. A quiet morning, a safe home, a day without incident. These should be enough for calm, but often they are not. In these moments, suffering arises from an invisible source, not from anything in the world, but from the way we relate to our own thoughts and perceptions. It emerges when the mind insists on interpreting neutrality as inadequacy, silence as emptiness, and stillness as stagnation. When we believe that nothing is wrong, we think we should feel content, yet the mind refuses to be satisfied with this emptiness. It begins to stir, and from that stirring comes the subtle, often unrecognized weight of unease. The mind is restless by nature. It seeks patterns, connections, and significance in everything. This is an ability that has kept humans alive, but it also has a shadow side. It invents problems where none exist. When the external world offers no challenge, no immediate danger, and no obvious reason for concern, the mind turns inward. It begins to examine memories, replay conversations, and speculate on future events. It generates hypothetical scenarios, projecting fears and regrets that have no present basis. The suffering that arises here is not caused by reality. It is caused by thought, the incessant, compulsive chatter of the mind that refuses to rest in what is simply. Every imagined slight, every possible failure, every unanswered question becomes a tiny point of friction, each one magnified by the mind's insistence that these thoughts are urgent and real. Attachment to thoughts creates invisible chains. We suffer because we confuse the movement of the mind with the truth of life. A thought arises, perhaps a worry about something trivial, and we react to it as though it were a storm in the sky. We feed it with attention, give it our energy, and allow it to shape our mood. What begins as a neutral observation becomes a judgment, and judgment becomes a story, and story becomes suffering. There is no external problem, but the mind has created one. It is as if the act of thinking itself, unchecked and unobserved, becomes the problem. This is why suffering does not require a problem. It is born in the space between perception and attachment, in the space where the mind cannot accept what is simple and untroubled. Our conditioning intensifies this phenomenon. From childhood, many of us are taught that discomfort must be justified, that happiness is temporary, and that life is a series of challenges to overcome. We learn to identify ourselves with struggle, to measure our existence by the intensity of our reactions. When there is no obstacle, no misfortune, no drama, the mind feels disoriented. It searches for a reason to be alive in the familiar currency of tension and dissatisfaction. Rest becomes anxiety because it is unfamiliar. Silence becomes a signal of emptiness because we have never learned to experience it as presence. The absence of conflict, rather than bringing relief, becomes an invitation for the mind to create one. Even subtle sensations of discontent can grow if we are unaware. A fleeting thought about inadequacy can evolve into guilt, which feeds into fear, which then spreads into worry. Soon, the mind is enmeshed in suffering, yet no external cause exists. The irony is that the mind is capable of generating endless complexity from simple moments. It twists neutrality into tension and calm into discomfort. The body may be healthy, the day may be pleasant, and circumstances favorable, but suffering still appears. It is an invention, an art of the mind, intricate and convincing, and it often goes unrecognized because it wears the mask of reality. The absence of problems is not the absence of suffering, because suffering is not a mechanical reaction to events. It is a process of the mind. The mind interprets, evaluates, and projects. It measures the present against the past, anticipates the future, and resists the present moment. In this resistance lies the root of suffering. When nothing is wrong, yet the mind cannot rest, suffering arises simply from the refusal to experience life as it is. It arises from expectation, comparison, and attachment. Even in perfect conditions, the mind can create storms of discontent from the smallest sparks of thought. The quiet moments, which should be fertile ground for peace, become the canvas on which the mind paints imagined distress. The mind seeks conflict when there is silence, and this is a phenomenon as subtle as it is powerful. We are conditioned to equate activity with life and noise with significance. When our environment is calm, when our schedules are uninterrupted, and when external pressures are absent, the mind experiences a peculiar form of discomfort. It is as if the silence itself is suspicious, as though it must hide some threat, some failure, or some imperfection that we have not yet noticed. This restlessness is not born of reality, it is born of expectation. The mind is accustomed to constant stimulation, to events, tasks, and problems that demand attention. When none of these are present, it cannot simply rest, and so it begins to create the very tension that is missing. The quiet becomes fertile ground for internal conflict, subtle, persistent, and often unnoticed, yet undeniably present. This internal conflict emerges in a variety of forms. Sometimes it is a replaying of the past, a continual examination of previous interactions, words said or unsaid, mistakes made, and opportunities lost. Even when the past has long since passed, the mind treats it as if it was still alive and pressing upon the present. At other times, the mind projects into the future, imagining scenarios that may never come to pass, crafting fears and anxieties from possibilities rather than realities. The mind anticipates danger, failure, or judgment, and in doing so manufactures conflict out of nothing. It is not that the world has presented a problem, but that the mind cannot tolerate the absence of one. Silence exposes the habits of thought that are otherwise hidden by distraction. When life is busy, the mind is occupied with tasks, errands, conversations, and obligations. In these moments, the movement of thought seems natural, necessary, even unavoidable, because it has something tangible to focus on. But when the external noise subsides, the mind has no anchor, no task to justify its activity. Left without engagement, it turns inward and begins to churn. It evaluates itself, its relationships, its circumstances, and its purpose. Small doubts, fleeting thoughts, and minor insecurities are amplified because there is no external input to balance them. The silence acts like a mirror, reflecting every thought, and the mind, unused to such reflection, interprets it as a threat, a deficiency, or a problem. Conflict, once internalized, becomes persistent. The mind begins to identify with it, taking the friction as a necessary component of existence. Many people are more comfortable with stress, worry, or agitation than with the calm of silence, because the latter reveals the mind's tendencies that have been suppressed or ignored. Without the distraction of noise or urgency, the mind must confront itself, and confrontation feels like conflict. It is not merely thinking, it is thinking with tension, evaluation, and judgment, a state in which every thought is treated as a battle to be won or lost. Even the act of sitting quietly becomes an exercise in resistance, as the mind protests against being unoccupied and unengaged. The mind also seeks conflict when there is silence because of its dependence on comparison. In silence, the mind turns to measuring, ranking, and analyzing oneself against others, against imagined ideals, or against past versions of the self. These comparisons, often subtle and unconscious, generate dissatisfaction and inner friction. Even when the present moment is peaceful and circumstances favorable, the mind creates disparity, highlighting perceived flaws, shortcomings, or failures. It invents crises of competence, worthiness, and identity, even when no external challenge exists. The quiet exposes a vacuum, and the mind fills it with conflict because it cannot bear emptiness. Moreover, silence can unearth unresolved emotions that have been buried beneath activity. Anger, regret, guilt, or sorrow may have been dormant, subdued by the noise of daily life. But when external activity stops, these emotions surface, and the mind begins to wrestle with them. This is not suffering caused by external events, but by the mind's habitual response to internal stimuli. In creating arguments, narratives, and judgments about these emotions, the mind maintains its state of conflict, as if life itself were incomplete without it. The silence, far from being a respite, becomes a trigger for the mind's tendency to generate tension, to imagine opposition, and to construct struggle from the very absence of struggle. The process is subtle and often unnoticed. One may sit in a quiet room, feeling uneasy for no apparent reason, attributing it to fatigue, boredom, or circumstance. Yet the source is within the mind, which has been trained by habit to seek engagement, drama, or conflict as a proof of existence. When there is silence, the mind invents challenge, because challenge has become synonymous with vitality. It prefers agitation over stillness, because the latter exposes its own nature, its assumptions, its fears, and its desires. In doing so, the mind continually manufactures the very conflict it believes it must navigate, and the quiet of life is transformed into an arena of mental struggle, a battlefield invisible yet persistent, shaping experience even when nothing in the external world demands it. Attachment to thought creates invisible chains, and this is one of the most profound sources of human suffering, yet it is also the least recognized. Thoughts arise spontaneously, effortlessly, without our conscious effort, yet we respond to them as though they were commands, as though every idea, worry, memory, or projection requires action, judgment, or emotional investment. In truth, thoughts are transient visitors, passing through the mind with no inherent authority. Yet the moment we cling to them, give them importance or identify with them, we begin to weave chains that bind our perception, our emotions, and even our behavior. These chains are invisible because they are entirely internal, experienced only by the one who creates them, yet they are as real as any physical constraint, shaping the way we interact with the world and ourselves. Attachment to thought manifests in countless subtle ways. A fleeting worry about what others think can grow into anxiety that governs social interaction. A judgment about one's past mistakes can become shame that dictates choices in the present. A desire for an imagined future can turn into longing, frustration, or dissatisfaction, even when all immediate circumstances are favorable. The thought itself is neutral, ephemeral, and often inaccurate, but by giving it credence, by assuming it is true or urgent, the mind strengthens it, building a lattice of belief around it. Each layer of belief reinforces the next, and soon, one thought becomes many, forming a network of invisible chains that constrict freedom. The mind is highly skilled at elaborating narratives, at taking a single impression or perception and spinning it into elaborate stories. When we attach to a thought, we enter this process willingly, believing that the narrative is reality. A passing thought, "I am not enough," becomes a judgment about self-worth, a measure of success or failure, and a lens through which every subsequent experience is interpreted. Another thought, "This could go wrong," becomes fear that prevents action, constraining possibilities that are otherwise open. Every attachment reinforces the mind's authority over our life. We begin to live according to the flow of thought rather than the reality of the moment, and in doing so, we lose access to clarity, peace, and spontaneity. Attachment also strengthens habitual patterns of thinking. Once the mind identifies with a particular thought or emotion, it tends to return to it repeatedly, creating mental grooves that deepen over time. Regret, worry, self-criticism, and imagined fear all become reinforced patterns, and each repetition tightens the invisible chains. The mind convinces itself that these patterns are essential, that they protect us, that they define us. In reality, they merely imprison us in cycles of perception that are unnecessary, repetitive, and often destructive. The freedom to respond freshly to each moment is replaced by the compulsion to respond according to the chains that attachment has forged. Emotions are particularly affected by attachment to thought. A thought can trigger anger, sadness, or anxiety, and the mind's insistence on holding on to that thought amplifies the emotional response. The more we identify with the thought, the more the emotion gains momentum. One small spark can ignite an internal fire, which appears to have life of its own, but is fueled entirely by our attachment. The chains are invisible, yet they bind both cognition and emotion, limiting perspective and narrowing the field of awareness. Emotional reactions that might have been fleeting and manageable instead become prolonged, overwhelming, and compulsive. Attachment to thought also affects behavior and decision-making. When the mind becomes entangled with ideas, judgments, and narratives, it begins to act not from observation or intuition, but from compulsion. We make choices to satisfy, defend, or align with our thoughts rather than in response to reality. A single belief, "I must succeed," can drive years of effort motivated more by fear of inadequacy than by genuine purpose. A recurring thought, "I am alone," can dictate social withdrawal or overcompensation. In every case, the invisible chains dictate the course of action, subtly yet decisively constraining freedom, creativity, and authenticity. The process is often reinforced by societal conditioning. From an early age, individuals are taught to value thought, reasoning, and opinion, sometimes at the expense of observation, stillness, or direct experience. The mind is trained to equate thinking with action, doing with value, and analysis with wisdom. Without conscious awareness, this training encourages attachment, creating chains that are accepted as natural, justified, and inevitable. People mistake the compulsion of thought for the structure of life itself, not realizing that the chains are of their own making, strengthened daily by attention, identification, and belief. In recognizing that attachment to thought creates invisible chains, one begins to see the subtle mechanics of suffering. Thoughts themselves are not the problem, nor are they inherently harmful. The problem arises when they are grasped, believed, or defended as truth, when they become the measure of reality rather than a passing aspect of consciousness. Each attachment is a link, each repetition a reinforcement, and the more attention we give, the stronger the binding. The freedom that comes from observing thought without attachment, from allowing it to arise and pass without judgment or identification, remains available, yet often unrecognized, because the mind is so accustomed to holding, shaping, and obeying every passing impulse. Identity is built on struggle, and this is a truth that shapes much of human perception and behavior, often without our conscious recognition. From an early age, individuals are taught to measure themselves by challenge, difficulty, and accomplishment. Struggle becomes the lens through which worth, value, and competence are assessed. When we encounter resistance, whether in learning, in relationships, or in achieving goals, we are told that perseverance and resilience define who we are. Over time, this conditioning leads the mind to equate identity with conflict. The presence of struggle is interpreted as a sign of vitality, significance, or authenticity, while the absence of struggle can evoke a sense of emptiness, unease, or even meaninglessness. We begin to define ourselves not by our presence or our being, but by our ability to endure, overcome, and suffer. This identification with struggle manifests in multiple layers of experience. Externally, it is reflected in the way individuals approach work, relationships, and personal goals. One may believe that achievement is only meaningful when it is hard-won, that love or success must be earned through effort, conflict, or sacrifice. Internally, it appears as a mental pattern in which challenge is sought even when unnecessary. The mind, accustomed to defining selfhood through adversity, may unconsciously create or magnify obstacles to maintain continuity of identity. Peace, calm, or ease is often perceived as unfamiliar territory, something unworthy or even threatening, because it does not fit the framework that has been built around struggle. A quiet moment, a seamless interaction, or a task accomplished effortlessly can feel hollow, as if something essential is missing, because it does not confirm the identity forged through friction and resistance. Identity built on struggle also shapes emotional life. Satisfaction is often fleeting, because the mind has learned to equate fulfillment with tension followed by resolution. Joy or contentment that arises without preceding difficulty may feel undeserved or illusory. Conversely, adversity, disappointment, or hardship can feel familiar and almost comforting, because they reinforce the sense of self that has been constructed through endurance. The mind becomes habituated to suffering as a form of validation, equating the presence of struggle with the proof of existence. One begins to unconsciously seek situations that test limits, provoke conflict, or create tension, not because these circumstances are inherently necessary, but because they align with the internal narrative of identity. This dynamic also affects perception and cognition. When identity is built on struggle, the mind interprets life through the lens of challenge. Neutral events are reframed as obstacles, minor frustrations are amplified, and stability or ease is undervalued. Even external circumstances that are favorable may be overlooked or dismissed, as the mind expects significance to arrive only through confrontation. The habitual association between struggle and selfhood narrows perspective, conditioning attention to seek difficulty and interpret calmness as insufficiency. In this way, struggle ceases to be merely an external experience and becomes an internalized measure, a constant reference point against which all experiences are judged. The construction of identity through struggle also intersects with societal and cultural narratives. Many cultures glorify hardship, perseverance, and heroic endurance, celebrating those who overcome adversity while minimizing or ignoring those who thrive without conflict. This reinforcement creates a feedback loop. Individuals learn to associate value with struggle and to view its absence with suspicion. Over time, Struggle is no longer merely an event in life. It becomes a defining characteristic of the self. People feel compelled to demonstrate resilience, to endure difficulty, or to highlight personal battles as evidence of authenticity, because identity itself has become inseparable from these experiences. Even spiritual and philosophical traditions, while often promoting peace and presence, can be interpreted in ways that reinforce the association of identity with struggle. The discipline required to follow a path of self-awareness, meditation, or moral rigor is sometimes seen as a form of testing or endurance. In such cases, the practice intended to cultivate freedom and clarity can inadvertently become another arena in which the mind measures itself through effort and perseverance. The attachment to struggle subtly infiltrates even endeavors meant to dissolve attachment, illustrating the depth to which identity can become intertwined with hardship. Ultimately, when identity is built on struggle, the mind cannot tolerate the absence of challenge. Ease, comfort, or neutrality becomes alien, producing subtle unease or dissatisfaction. The internal landscape is conditioned to seek friction, whether through external circumstances or internal narratives, because friction is what validates existence. Even when life is abundant, safe, or harmonious, the mind searches for obstacles, discomfort, or tension to reaffirm identity. This unconscious pattern creates cycles in which suffering is perpetuated, not as a response to life itself, but as a self-reinforcing proof of identity. Within this framework, the question arises: if identity is bound to struggle, what happens when struggle is absent? The mind may respond with restlessness, inventing challenges or anxieties to maintain the familiar sense of self. It may reject simplicity or calm as inconsequential or even threatening. In this way, struggle ceases to be merely external adversity and becomes a psychological necessity, a prerequisite for feeling alive, relevant, or complete. Identity is no longer a reflection of presence or awareness, but a product of conflict, tension, and endurance. And the mind remains ensnared in this pattern, continuously seeking validation through the very struggle it has been trained to equate with being. Peace feels uncomfortable to the undisciplined mind, and this is a truth that reveals the intricate ways in which our habits of thought shape experience. The mind, when untrained, is accustomed to constant motion, mental chatter, emotional turbulence, and a relentless engagement with the external world. It thrives on distraction, stimulation, and the pursuit of problems, projects, and judgments. Silence, calm, and simplicity are foreign to it, unfamiliar territories that the unpracticed mind interprets as a lack of significance or as emptiness. Peace is not inherently threatening, yet the undisciplined mind perceives it as unstable, incomplete, or even suspicious because it exposes patterns of thought that are usually hidden beneath the noise of activity. When stillness arrives, the mind instinctively attempts to fill it, to occupy it, or to escape it, demonstrating that peace, in its natural form, is incompatible with a mind untrained in observation and restraint. The discomfort arises because peace reveals the mind's habitual tendencies. When thoughts are allowed to flow freely without interruption, they often expose patterns of fear, attachment, and judgment. These patterns, normally masked by busyness or distraction, become visible when the mind is invited into quiet. The untrained mind is startled by this exposure because it has never faced itself without external stimuli. Restlessness, subtle anxiety, or even boredom emerge as a result, giving the impression that peace itself is the source of unease. Yet the discomfort is not in peace. It is in the mind's recognition of its own entanglement and its inability to remain grounded in simplicity. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting habitual reactions and unresolved tensions that are otherwise hidden by action or distraction. Emotions also play a role in this discomfort. The undisciplined mind is tightly coupled with emotional responses to thought. When life is active, these emotions are channeled outward toward tasks, interactions, and challenges. When peace is present, however, emotions that were suppressed or diverted surface. Anxiety, sadness, guilt, or irritation may rise subtly, appearing unprovoked, because they have been waiting for the opportunity to manifest in a neutral field. The mind interprets these emotions as a threat, reinforcing the sense that peace is uncomfortable or incomplete. The experience of peace is thus filtered through the lens of unprocessed mental and emotional material, creating a paradox in which calm is simultaneously desired and resisted. Another reason peace is uncomfortable to the undisciplined mind is the fear of non-activity. The mind has been conditioned to equate doing with being, productivity with significance, and engagement with existence. When these markers are absent, when one is simply present without agenda, the mind questions the value and relevance of the moment. The stillness exposes the mind's dependency on constant input and validation, generating subtle panic or unease. It is as if the mind has forgotten how to inhabit experience without an accompanying narrative, plan, or problem. Peace, by its very nature, does not require justification, and the unpracticed mind struggles to tolerate a state that does not demand effort, analysis, or control. Attachment to outcomes intensifies the discomfort. The mind often measures the value of experiences by results, what is gained, avoided, or achieved. Peace, however, offers no measurable outcome. It cannot be quantified, controlled, or captured. The untrained mind resists this lack of structure because it cannot grasp the meaning of experience without a goal or result. The mind may attempt to create conflict or thought activity to regain a sense of purpose, generating distraction or subtle tension, even in otherwise serene conditions. The very attempt to control or interpret peace becomes a source of discomfort, illustrating the mind's habitual need for engagement, stimulation, and validation. Sensory habituation also contributes to the unease. In a life dominated by noise, movement, and stimulation, the absence of these cues can feel unnatural. The undisciplined mind expects constant input and interprets its absence as a problem, a void, or a signal that something is missing. This expectation of stimulation reinforces the mind's discomfort with peace, creating a pattern in which calmness triggers restlessness, simply because it is unfamiliar and unstructured. Even subtle moments of stillness are filtered through this conditioned response, and the mind struggles to inhabit the quiet without generating inner agitation. Finally, the undisciplined mind struggles with peace because it has never learned observation without interference. Observation is not mere attention, it is the ability to witness thought, emotion, and experience without identification, judgment, or reaction. The untrained mind cannot sit in this way, and when invited to do so by a state of peace, it experiences tension. Every passing thought becomes urgent, every emotion appears significant, and every sensation demands evaluation. In this state, peace is uncomfortable not because of any flaw in the moment, but because the mind is unskilled in allowing life to simply be, revealing the depth to which habitual reactivity and attachment have shaped perception. Peace, therefore, acts as a mirror to the undisciplined mind, reflecting its habitual turbulence, its attachments, its expectations, and its resistance. The discomfort is an expression of the mind confronting its own patterns, realizing for the first time that calm does not require control, engagement, or justification. In this way, the experience of peace exposes the mind's limitations and gently challenges the patterns that sustain suffering. Freedom begins with observation, not control, and understanding this principle is essential to breaking the patterns that bind the mind. Many people equate freedom with the ability to act, to manipulate circumstances, or to impose will upon life. They believe that if they can shape events, dictate outcomes, or command behavior, they will be free from suffering, limitation, or uncertainty. Yet this is a misconception. The pursuit of control is endless because the external world is inherently unpredictable, and the mind's desire to dominate it only generates frustration, tension, and anxiety. True freedom arises not from attempting to govern life, but from observing it, and oneself, with clarity and impartiality. Observation is the practice of witnessing without interference, of noticing thought, emotion, and sensation without immediately reacting, judging, or attempting to alter. In this space of awareness, the mind discovers a form of liberation that is not contingent on circumstances, outcomes, or external validation. Observation cultivates freedom because it interrupts the habitual identification with thought and emotion. Most suffering occurs when the mind confuses passing phenomena with truth or selfhood. A fleeting worry about the future can be mistaken for reality. A passing irritation can be interpreted as permanent, and a momentary feeling of inadequacy can be internalized as identity. In such cases, the mind reacts compulsively, attempting to control the uncontrollable in a futile effort to achieve security, comfort, or certainty. Observation, however, creates a pause between stimulus and response. By noticing thoughts and emotions as they arise, without immediately acting on them, the mind disengages from automatic patterns. The act of watching without attachment allows one to recognize that thoughts are not commands, feelings are not imperatives, and circumstances are not inherently threatening. This recognition creates the first real space in which freedom can exist because the compulsion to control, resist, or manipulate is weakened. Observation also shifts the focus from external events to internal processes. While control seeks to manage outcomes, observation attends to awareness itself. This subtle but profound shift transforms the mind's relationship to life. Instead of struggling to change reality, one learns to understand reality as it is, moment by moment. Patterns of thought, habitual reactions, and emotional tendencies become visible, not as immutable truths, but as objects for insight. The untrained mind may resist this process, equating passivity with weakness or inaction. Yet in truth, observation is an active form of engagement. It is the deliberate cultivation of clarity, the practice of seeing without distortion, and the discipline of attending fully to the present moment. Through observation, the illusion of control is gradually dismantled. Many people assume that by micromanaging life, they can prevent discomfort, ensure happiness, or eliminate uncertainty. This assumption leads to constant effort, tension, and disappointment because life does not conform to desire or expectation. Observation, in contrast, does not attempt to force life into a preferred shape. It accepts events, sensations, and experiences as they are, allowing the mind to respond with wisdom rather than reaction. In this acceptance, one discovers freedom not through the imposition of will, but through understanding. The realization that resistance to what is only perpetuates suffering, while clarity of perception opens possibilities previously obscured by obsession with control. Observation also fosters self-mastery in a subtle but profound way. The mind, when left unchecked, is prone to compulsive thought, projection, and judgment. Observation trains attention, allowing one to witness mental activity without immediate engagement. Over time, this practice strengthens discernment, the ability to see which impulses are useful, which thoughts are productive, and which reactions are habitual traps. With discernment comes the capacity to choose responses consciously rather than reactively, a form of freedom that cannot be achieved through control of external events alone. The more one observes, the less one is enslaved by impulse, habit, or expectation. Furthermore, observation reveals the impermanent nature of experience. Thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise and pass in continuous flow. The undisciplined mind resists this transience, attempting to cling to pleasure, reject discomfort, and control outcomes. Observation, however, illuminates the fleeting quality of all phenomena. By witnessing without interference, one experiences reality in its natural rhythm, recognizing that attachment and aversion are self-imposed limitations. This awareness reduces suffering and cultivates freedom by loosening the grip of desire and fear. Observation also cultivates clarity in decision-making. When the mind is reactive, choices are influenced by past conditioning, fear, and unexamined impulse. Through careful attention, one gains insight into the motivations behind thoughts and actions. This insight allows for deliberate, informed responses rather than automatic reactions. Decisions made from observation are rooted in understanding rather than compulsion, in alignment with reality rather than resistance, and in wisdom rather than habit. Ultimately, freedom is discovered not by forcing life into a mold, but by cultivating the ability to see clearly, to understand deeply, and to respond with awareness. Control seeks to bend the world to desire. Observation learns to navigate the world with discernment. Control generates tension. Observation generates clarity. Control is temporary, bound by circumstance. Observation is enduring, anchored in awareness. By prioritizing observation over control, the mind loosens the invisible chains that attachment, fear, and desire have forged, opening the possibility for liberation within the very fabric of daily experience.